Good afternoon. This is Gary Kavanagh here on TRSI, and I'm here with my friend and colleague Michael Dwyer for an episode which we were physically threatened if we did not produce.
Were we?
Well, you weren't. I was.
Well, yeah.
I assume if someone is going to go to the effort of hurting me, you're also going to be hurt, even if just kind of an amendum to the main thing.
Yeah, no, I think basically they don't really consider that I exist at all. Anything that goes towards you. Which is why I'm always hopeful that if we're ever in a motorcade and there's an assassination attempt, they'll go for your car and they'll completely ignore me.
We're a team here, Michael. If someone breaks my legs, they're going to break your legs too.
I'm not sure if I'm happy about that, really. I mean, perfectly happy to be left out of that particular team, but
yeah, I think there's also an additional episode of Sarah and John's podcast going up today, an emergency version of it, just to celebrate the loss of the referendum, because those people do not know how to stay in their own lanes on Friday.
It's not classy though either, is it, Gary? That's the thing that I find. It's basically a gloat fest. That's what it will be, which is not what this will be. This will be a calm analysis.
Every week, we have to go 2 days after them, where they've already discussed nearly all of the news of the week, and this 1 week something happens on Saturday that we can talk about, or well, Friday and Saturday, and they swoop in and just do a second one.
Yeah.
It's actually given me a lot of positive feeling towards the standards of the civil service. You know, where you look at someone and you're like, you're doing too much work and I'm just looking bad in comparison. Like, we're struggling to do one a week. You don't get to do two.
Yeah, but they're doing two, Gary, but they're doing it for all the wrong reasons. All the wrong fundamental motivations and intentions. And we know, really, it's intentions that matter. And their intentions, their motivations are wrong and low and nasty. And that Sarah Ryan one, oh, she will be enjoying this. I can just imagine it. I won't be able to listen to it this week, or at least I'll need a few days to prep myself because it's just going to be nauseating.
I know. She'll be drunk. The sound of neglected children will be audible in the background. Someone should do something about that.
Yeah, somebody should. The sound of a harassed dentist trying to sweep up his children and maybe bring them off to a park somewhere as she shouts at them and throwing empty champagne bottles around the gaff.
I mean, I won't, because she might actually bottle me.
She might. She's like that.
The fact it will be a champagne bottle will be absolutely no benefit to me.
No, quite the reverse. Champagne bottle, that big heavy bottom, because champagne bottles are designed to hold pressurized liquid, so they're far more substantial than ordinary bottles are. Do a lot more damage.
This is all meant in good faith. I will, of course, text Sarah after this goes up saying, oh, by the way, in the last episode I implied that you were an alcoholic who was neglecting your own children. And Sarah will have to take that with good grace, because by me telling her, it would be classless if she didn't.
True.
Excellent. This is why I was once voted most likely to be stabbed to death.
I can see that.
A lot of people could, according to the vote results. So, Michael, the referendum.
There was a referendum, Gary, and it lost.
2 referendums. The results, the first one came in, and it was the second worst loss in a referendum. And it then got pushed down to become the third worst loss in a referendum, because when the second referendum's results came in, they were now the worst that had ever happened in the history of the state. It is important to note that it's not a 50-50 chance that referendums are won or lost. Because governments plan referendums and, presumably have some idea of what the public want or don't want, the vast majority of referendums are won. Because if you think you're not going to win, you don't tend to run them. So this is an innovative strategy to lose horrifically on every count. The maps of which constituencies voted for and against these measures are quite illuminating, because on the first one, the family referendum, I believe Dunleary voted for it, and that's it.
Correct. Dunleary voted with a swinging victory at 50.29 yes, no 49.71. You
know there is someone in, let's say, Fine Gael HQ after these results came in who tried to make a joke about that, and all of his colleagues just glared at him and said, shut the fuck up. And then, of course, in the Care referendum, they didn't win a single constituency, which, I mean, Michael, I've been involved in some political losses, but we always had Donegal.
There was always Donegal. And, in fact, Donegal did well for itself in this one as well. Donegal voting on the Care referendum, 83.97 no. So we can call that 84% between friends.
I think the funnest one was Cherry Orchard in Dublin, which came back with, I believe, a 96% no vote.
Some of the votes from Dublin were fantastic, and we'll get into that maybe a bit later.
Probably the point to open with is this. This is obviously deeply embarrassing to the government. This was a referendum that they didn't seem to terribly care about, but yet decided to put massive amounts of political capital into, to involve their TDs, to involve their activists, to spend their own money. And they turned something where they could have just left this to the Greens, let the Greens lose, into something where they've all lost. It's an entirely self-inflicted wound.
It hasn't really been talked about very much, but it was always there. This was part of the programme for government, they could say. Our colleagues in the Green Party desire this, they could say. We are going to do this because we respect the programme for government, but we are not going to take a position on it as a party, as Fianna Fáil or as Fine Gael. Individual members of the party can take a position on it and they can do what they like. But they didn't. You say they didn't care about it. And I think that at a certain level, I think large members of the, shall we say, membership, swathe of the membership of the party didn't care about it, or actually were quite hostile to it. Most of the members of the Oireachtas were not that exercised about it. But at the top level, if they didn't care about it, why did they double down on it? Why did they reached a point and then where they could have just said, okay, we've done what we need to do. Now we're going to just gradually detach ourselves from this. We're not going to be there. We're going to be kind of emollient. We're going to choose to use language which leaves us open to a reconciliation with those voters who might vote against it. We're not going to get too heated or too committed to it. But they didn't. That's a very odd thing, Gary. Rather than leaving themselves that little bit of wriggle room and that little escape room, if it genuinely was something that they weren't that bothered about, and I think it was something they weren't that bothered about, because it wasn't a big thing anyway, they doubled down.
The problem, I think, with these kind of pointless kind of vibe referendums is when you start saying if people vote a certain way, that means a certain thing, and you start instilling results with particular feelings that don't need to be there. I mean, so some of the conversation from Fine Gael was very much if people vote against this, then they're displaying certain feelings towards single mothers, to one-parent families, which didn't need to be the reality at all. But now they've made it a case that, okay, well, now you've lost a referendum somehow on that basis. A kind of very bizarre turnaround. We now see every other party basically saying it wasn't our fault, it was the government's fault, which would be slightly more compelling had those parties not themselves come out and said, we fully support this and we're going to campaign against it, although we don't like the wording, as opposed to, we don't like the wording and therefore we're not going to advocate for this result. It's kind of hard to say the campaign wasn't fought hard enough when you were the campaign as well as the government. The only person I've seen deal with this well has been Leo Varadkar, who just came out and said, we got this one badly wrong. We were unable to convince people of the need for any referendum, let alone this referendum, and we have to take responsibility for that. Which, to be fair to him, is all true, and, exactly what needed to be said. No ducking or diving. I saw, for a second there, I forgot the name of the leader of Labour, which is not a good sign for either her public persona or my neurological health. Did you see where she was talking to, I think it was RTE, and she was talking about the government's lacklustre campaign, and then said, I believe the exact phrase was, Labour cannot be faulted for its own campaign.
Yeah.
Which is, we are, of course, blameless here. So I think we'll get into kind of what the referendum might mean and what the downstream results are. One thing I did want to kind of open up with straight ahead is that there were basically no exit polls of this referendum. The Sunday Independent has an exit poll, but its methodology is incredibly messy. I'm not sure how much stock I would put in it. Now, I have heard certain people say that they were polled in person at the polling stations. So it's entirely possible that someone paid for exit polling, but it wasn't one of the media companies, and it was a private poll, which means it will likely never be released. I have nothing to back this up, Michael, but I have heard multiple people say they were polled, so presumably something was happening there. If I had to guess, as in make a guess based on absolutely nothing, I would say that Sinn Féin is probably the most likely organisation to have paid for that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you might think that, because I think Sinn Féin is also the party that has, weirdly, put themselves in the most awkward position because of this. And we might as well talk about it now. This was a little bit of an oddball campaign, as you said, Gary, because it actually really was basically a performative piece of politics. So it wasn't really clear to a lot of us, although, as we said, we have friends who believe it was about an awful lot more. But on the face of it, it was kind of a small potatoes thing. They never really established a good, strong narrative of why this was necessary, why this had to be done, what the great objective was. So therefore, there was a sense of, well, why are we doing this at all? And that meant that you get in the same way as in a presidential election, it's never about politics because it can't be. It becomes about personality, and that's why presidential elections can be very, very nasty indeed here, because it comes down to the issue of character and personality, and whether this person is a trustworthy person, a nice person, a decent person, and that will never have to be nasty. In this case, it became about characterizing the feelings, the vibe, the whatever that you demonstrated by voting one way or the other. It was literally a form of virtue signaling, that awful phrase, that this was a way you could signal your virtue by voting yes, even though you didn't really care that much about it. And in the midst of all this, Sinn Féin did Sinn Féin, or Mary Lou, whoever made the decision, did the single oddest thing that happened in the whole campaign, Gary. And that was come out and say, we'll run it again.
Yeah. I would like to see the Sinn Féin candidate wander on into Cherry Orchard with their 96% no vote and be like, well, lads, you didn't understand it, so we'll do it again. And just see what the reaction is of their people on the ground.
Have you got a theory why they would do that? Because of all of the things that come out of this is the one. I'll give you, and here's one of the reasons why I think this is an odd thing. We look at the Dublin constituencies. I mentioned that Donegal was up at 84%, right? And that Donegal, this is a Dublin constituency, Gary. The constituency of Dublin Northwest, which includes Finglas and Ballymun. They voted 79.48 no on the Care Amendment. 79, that's a Dublin constituency now. And that Desi Ellis, I think, got something like 44% of first preference votes in that constituency last time out. This is the kind of constituency which you're going to expect to get a really significant Sinn Féin presence. It turns out that we can't absolutely, well, we have some exit polling, so we can have a guess. We can't absolutely parse it. But that Sinn Féin voters were a very large and very significant proportion of the people who voted no. And that wasn't a completely unpredictable result either, Gary. So why would you leave yourself open to this thing? Why would you say we're going to run it again? First of all, and any party saying it, with the history of Lisbon, and they said, do it, and if you don't get it right, we'll make you do it again. And this is a voting population which is more detached, more cynical, less trusting of politicians than it was even 20 years ago. Bad idea. But for that party to do it, there's no way they can do this. I mean, there's no way that they can commit to doing this again without damaging themselves stupidly.
We've talked extensively about the internal splits in Sinn Féin and the problem that Sinn Féin has keeping all of those people together and how much worse it's going to be in government. And I think we saw an example of that here. There are many different directions they're being pulled and they're struggling to find, okay, well, how do we actually position this to not piss off anyone? I thought it was I think we talked about it during the referendum. I thought it was a terrible idea. Certain people said that, okay, well, maybe it's basically Sinn Féin giving their voters permission to vote no. And, you know, maybe that was the internal thought behind it. I don't understand why that would be. It strikes me as a very Fine Gael kind of move, if that was the case.
Absolutely.
Where, someone internally convinces themselves of something that seems quite smart, but as soon as you hear it, you sort of go, yeah, that could very easily backfire on you. Aintu actually had a recent one like that as well, with Patter deciding he was going to run for Europe. And you go, okay, yeah, you run for Europe, you get all the pluses, maybe it helps your profile, but at the same time, is that really... I can see why you're doing it, but I'm not sure that's a good idea.
Yeah, because what happens if you win?
And then you have to come out and say, oh, well, I'm going to step aside so I can rerun in the general, and it just...
And that's the question you're going to be asked constantly is, well, if you win, what are you going to do? Are you going to go to Europe? And you're going to have to say no, because Aintu has to have a member in the Dáil. people are going to say, well, if you're not going to go, well, why are you running? Why should we vote for you if you're not going to be the person we're going to send?
I'm sure internally they're like, no, this makes sense and we're doing it for these reasons. But it's very easy to convince yourself of something that someone from outside looking at would immediately go, that's a terrible idea.
Yes.
Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is some internal reason that makes it seem like a good idea, in the same way maybe Sinn Féin had one. But it's the sort of thing I've seen in politics before, and they very rarely go well.
If that was the reasoning, that would be, it seems to me, too clever by half. You're getting into semaphore at that and smoke signals at that stage, and I don't buy it. You're still left with the problem that you've committed yourself to do something in which you don't do, and it's not a good look, and I don't see.
The secret to politics is doing very simple. It's like business. You will be successful in business if you figure out very simple things that you can do, and you do them extremely well. When you start getting into like fucking high level things like this, it never really works out. That's true in politics as well. Like all of the stuff about your Cambridge Analytica and individualized advertising targeting and stuff like that. None of that stuff ever worked. It was, well, you could get results, but it was so expensive it didn't actually make any sense to do it. But people have this fixation on that, that tool or that technique or that strategy that will set you aside. And actually a lot of Sinn Féin's success has been just being better at groundwork and party discipline and having a stronger sense of self than the other parties, not having an app.
No, they've done the old-fashioned, historically understood things well, and they have also, I would say, been lucky in their timing, that at the time when Irish politics blew up and we had the meltdown in the economy and the breakdown of the historical shape of the parties and the destruction of Fianna Fáil, that they were there, and there wasn't really anybody else competing with them for that vote.
There is obviously an element of luck in Sinn Féin's success, but to be fair to Sinn Féin, what I would say is oftentimes to take advantage of lucky situations, you have to have done quite a lot of the prep work itself.
Yeah, I'm not saying that to diminish them, because I believe that luck is just part of life. It's woven into the fabric. But you have to have put yourself in a position to be lucky. And you have to have the capacity when you're given the slice of luck to make use of it and to go on with it. Luck by itself will only it'll give you a momentary advantage, but they took their bit of luck and they made full use of it. And as you say, they'd also, by dint of good choices and hard work and on the ground development, put themselves in the position to be the party that was there when it came along. And they've also, I think, consistently made good choices. We won't litigate it again, but for example, Renewa were in a position with Lucinda at the beginning, and they made, I think at the beginning, they made the wrong choices. Or in fact, you might argue the problem was they didn't make any choices at all. And then suddenly they woke up to find that the opportunity had fled. They had been given a slice of luck, maybe you could call it luck. They were given an opportunity, but they didn't strike while the iron was hot, to use the cliche, and it all evaporated.
No. But I suppose back in the referendum, I suppose the thing I would like to most say is this. Due to the lack of exit polls, and the Sunday Independent, the exit poll, I'll link it below, it doesn't seem very good. I mean, they text people, then they fed their responses into ChatGPT, and then they, for some reason, even though that was the standard they were willing to set, they don't seem to have done any sort of, they did kind of a basic sentiment analysis, but no. Anyway, what I'm saying is I wouldn't rely on it. The only interesting thing that comes out of it that I think they could probably stand over is which way members of individual political parties and political party voters voted for. That I think they can probably stand over and is legitimately interesting. But the point I would make is because the exit polls, you're about to hear probably several weeks of what I would describe as self-interested bullshit as to what this referendum meant, as in why people voted the way they did.
Yeah.
And all I would like to say there is that because there was no exit polls, we don't have any idea why people voted the way they did. Now you can say, okay, some of it might be an anti-government vote, some of it might have been because people didn't like the wording, they didn't think it went far enough, things like that. All of those things probably contributed in some sense, but the actual information you want is how important was that to people? How many people did that move? I mean, you can say on the care point maybe, and the power of some of the left-wing NGOs, you could say you can maybe see that in the difference between the family referendum and the care referendum. But even that is, tenuous. So what you're going to start hearing is people coming out and saying that this represents a political rejection of the government on one hand, and people coming out and saying, basically, this is a rejection of a right-wing amendment when it should have been a left-wing amendment on the other. And all of these people, and I realise there is a slight irony in someone who does a commentary show, or podcast as we now call them, saying this, but it's something to be aware of. None of the people who will be telling you these things know what they are talking about, because no one, apart from whoever, if that polling was carried out, paid for that private exit polling, knows why this happened. It's all just assumptions and probably self-interest.
And if anybody out there has access to the private exit polling and wanted to send us in some of that data, we'd be perfectly happy to read it.
Okay, Sarah I text Sarah as this episode was going on. She's okay just making jokes about her neglecting her children and having a drinking problem. So if you've got any here, Michael, just throw them in.
No, she scares me too much, Gary. I think that she could be physically violent very easily.
Not Keith, just Sarah.
Oh, Keith? Oh, God, Keith terrifies me.
There's something of the flats in him.
Oh, there's something of the flats very, very definitely in them,
Anyway, so I suppose that was on the actual referendum. That, I think, is the most important thing. A lot of why people voted, we do not know. Now, we can talk about what the likely consequences of the vote are going to be, but a lot of what you're hearing about, the why in the past is nonsense. It can just be safely ignored. The important thing is that it did happen, and it came out like this. It was hugely embarrassing. It was an absolute blowout. It was, a clean sweep and the worst referendum defeat in the history of the state.
What had been previously the worst one?
The previous worst one was the referendum to reduce the age of the presidency, because for those who aren't aware, there is a minimum age to become president in Ireland, and it is moderately old. And there was a referendum basically to get rid of the minimum age for the presidency. And I thought this was a perfectly acceptable thing to do. It doesn't need to be there. The public can be trusted on to vote the appropriate person in. And if we can't trust the people to vote the appropriate person in, why do we think a slightly older person is going to be the appropriate person? Also, the other thing I would note there is that Michael Collins, by the time he died, would not have been old enough to run for president of Ireland. But it got crushed. It lost, I think, 73.1%, I think, was how badly that lost. Yeah, I know. I actually thought that was a decent referendum. But there you go. I think I wanted to read you something, Michael.
Far ahead.
Because I thought... So, this is I'm going to just ask you if you know where this came from. So they're talking about when the government came out and admitted defeat, and how it was a hell of a defeat for the government. And it says, it wasn't just the government's proposition, of course. It was supported by almost all of the opposition parties, with the important exception of Peadar Tóibín's Aontú. It was also backed by trade unions and by the government-funded NGO sector, including groups like the National Women's Council, which made much of the running throughout the campaign. Those who purport to speak for workers and women and people with disabilities supported the measures, but very many workers and women and people with disability didn't. Obvious questions now present themselves for these groups. On this question, anyway, the NGOs seem to speak principally for themselves. This government and probably future ones are likely to take note of that. Where would you think that's from?
Oh, I don't know. Somebody talking to Ben Scallon, or...
It's a kind of a grippy tone to it, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a gripty kind of vibe to it. Maybe somebody from Aontú, because they name-checked Peadar Tóibín, so Aontú person.
And then it goes on to say that due to this result, senior government figures were wondering about the future of the hate speech legislation. But it didn't come from Gript. It actually came from Pat Leahy in the Irish Times. It was his review of the vote in this referendum.
Well...
I find that quite interesting.
Yes, interesting, curious. Maybe for certain people, it may be a little bit of a worry if Pat Leahy is saying things like that. Saying the, not unsayable, but the things that shouldn't be said. It's
a deep problem for the NGOs, because the NGOs' secret, the source of the NGOs' power, is not the government funding. The government funding comes from this. It's their ability to convince people that they are representative organisations and that they fairly and accurately represent the views of their members. And basically, Peter Mayer talks about this in Ruling the Void. As grassroots have died, as membership organisations in the foreign political groups have died, as memberships have fallen, all across the West, governments have turned to representative organisations basically to make the governments look representative. Because without their widespread membership and the massive amount of people involved, they can't say they have widespread daily political support like they used to. So these organisations become important. But there's always that question of how representative are they? And in Ireland, I would say very much not, for the most part.
Absolutely.
I mean, as we discussed, Michael, previously, the NWCI amended its constitution so that individual women could not become members of it. Its membership is entirely NGOs.
Mm-hmm. Corporate.
And the problem that this represents for them, and I mean, the research that Gript has done on this as well, is that as that sense of representativeness chips away, all that's left exposed is the reality of these organisations, which is often 10 lads in a room doing whatever the hell they want, funded massively by public donations because, well, you know, there's a National Women's Council. Of course you have to fund that.
Yes, they exist, their authority exists only if there is almost mystery about them. If people start to ask the fundamental question, if it occurs to people to ask the question, well, how did you achieve this status as being the representative body for women to speak on women's issues and to speak for women? How did that happen? And how is that authority being maintained? To what extent or in what sense are you in fact representative of Irish women? Then you're squandered, because the fact is, Gary, one has a sense that there are not an insignificant number of advocacy NGOs who exist because a group of people got in a room and gave themselves a title.
Yes, and they engage in... The writer Conor Fitzgerald is a Substack, he's a very good writer, highlighted a process called consensus laundering, where basically someone says something and then another organisation picks it up and another organisation picks that up. And we've talked about something similar with research and with media reports, where basically you see this laundering process where by the end of it, no one knows where it started, and that at the very start, it was basically an unsupported claim, but then it gets picked up by someone more prestigious, and then more prestigious, and more prestigious, and by the end of it, it's not this randomer said something while he was sitting in his garage, it's the New York Times said this.
Yes.
And with the NGOs, a lot of their proof that they are representative is their involvement with government departments, because they are representative, and involvement with other NGO initiatives, so that they're involved with other NGO groups which are concerned with the same issue. And it's basically just... Do you know what a rat king is?
Yes. It's a lovely image.
Yeah, Irish NGOs are rat kings. What a rat king is it's a collection of rats whose tails get bound together in some way. Like they could get wrapped in some sort of, if there's a twine or something sticky. And basically, they merge together into... just a putrid mess, really. Because none of them can pull away from each other, because you pull one out, they'll all die. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is a pretty perfect description of a lot of the Irish NGOs. They're supported by each other. Once you start pulling that thread apart, you kind of realise there's not a lot to these lads.
And you get to the point where, at a very banal level, you start saying, well, why are we giving you €900,000?
I think a very reasonable question and of course the answer is because you're representative, and then their proof of being representative is that the department gives them money for being representative, and then they do things with the department because, they're representative. So it's like, oh, well, we do this work showing about the impact of this on women, and we're paid to do that work because, we know so much about women. And that's why we have no members.
The number one group that is going to potentially, and I say potentially because we shall see if it actually happens, but the number one group that has inevitably put themselves out there and is now going to come under the microscope is the National Council for Women of Ireland, and why they exist, what right they have to speak on behalf of those women, and what right have they got to be so well funded by the taxpayers of Ireland. And I think that's going to be an uncomfortable couple of weeks. I don't think it'll last much more than a couple of weeks, but you know what? Who knows?
No, things are very quickly forgotten in politics. And another issue could arise and simply take this off the table. But I think Pat Leahy is probably right about things like the hate speech bill or about some of the referendums that the NGOs have been pushing for because they say the public want them.
Yeah.
Politicians and department officials, to a surprising amount, have believed, with a credulity verging on, I would say, gullibility, things that NGOs have told them for quite a long time. The NGOs have become incredibly well integrated. And if people stop and go, yes, but you told us that this was going to be popular, and very clearly it isn't, there might be a sort of, what else have you told us is going to be popular that would actually be disastrously bad for us to do?
Yes.
And that's not a question they want, because if people start going, so that thing you told us was popular, how did you determine it was popular? The answer in a lot of those cases is going to be because it's what we want you to do. Not, we have polled people and actually determined, this is good.
Or, well, a bunch of us were out for a drink in Café on Seine after work on Friday, and we all thought it was a good idea. So, who could have believed that it wouldn't be a good idea? Because everybody we know voted for it. So what happened? It's very strange. I have often thought over the last quite some years that one of the oddest things in Irish politics is the sense that TDs give you that they have more confidence in some NGOs' capacity to tell them what's going to be a good idea, what's going to be a popular idea, what's going to be a workable idea than they have themselves. That's bizarre to me. That the idea that a TD doesn't trust his own or her own instinct dealing with people in clinics, dealing with the public over these people. But I think that they're easily impressed, a lot of them, by these people.
I think we've lost out by getting rid of so many of the old publicans, because you had the old publicans, you put someone in front of them who was a professor and you got a bit of a, yeah, that's all right, but what do you know about milking cows? And I think that was actually immensely helpful.
Yeah, a little
because
bit.
A lot of these people are not worth listening to, but it's very easy to blind, particularly civil servants, with a good title. Love a good title, but it doesn't really do anyone any good, does it?
Blind me with science, blind me with bullshit, and I think that's a degree of that's what's going on. I have to. One of the things that I have been slightly surprised by, slightly only, is during the course of this campaign, the number of people that I've discovered who are involved in politics that are barristers is really quite almost shocking. Every other person is, is he a lawyer? Oh yeah, he's a barrister. Not just solicitors, barristers. They have infested the gaff, Gary.
They have, and strangely enough, Michael, and this is just my personal view, the quality of legislation, as in the actual legal quality of it, has declined quite a lot. As more barristers have gotten involved, which is, we shall not say that reflects anything about the trade. But one thing we were talking about NGOs that I thought was actually quite interesting, when the Ditch came out with what they said was the leaked Attorney General's advice, I started calling around to try and figure out, was this actually the advice? I mean, it looked legitimate, but you want to be sure. And I at the end, I actually could not verify. I had some people saying, yeah, like it looks solid, but we're not 100% sure. I also asked a couple of them how they thought it had leaked. And the number one response I got was that someone had probably given it to one of the NGOs, and that it had leaked from the NGOs. Now, that might just be rampant ass covering, because leaking the Attorney General's analysis is actually quite serious.
Yes.
Or it could just indicate the belief these people have in how integrated these NGOs are into the government process, that they would have access to Attorney General's information at a time when we know that Mary Lou McDonald did not. Now, people might say, yeah, but the opposition does not get Attorney General advice. Mary Lou could have perfectly well went to Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and the Greens and said, we will support you, but we want to see the advice. That was absolutely something they could have done. Fine Gael could have said no. That was the worst that could have happened. But the fact that people would assume that even though that is true, and that the Attorney General's advice is meant to be kept to the government, that NGOs, or at least an NGO, may have gotten access to it, says something about how integrated these people think NGOs are into the government.
Yeah, but I think that's reflective of reality. Gary, you and I have been hanging around the gates of Leinster House often enough over the last few years to see and understand, talk to people, that there is a carousel. That if you're from a certain organisation or group, or you're from a certain place, you just walk in and you get a meeting. You walk in, you get a room. You walk in, you can put on a show. No questions asked. For other people, it is far, far more difficult. If you have the temporary government, which is the elected, and then you have the permanent government, which is the civil service, you might say we have the semi-permanent government, which is the NGO sector, it is, maybe that's an overstatement, but it's moving towards a situation where they are increasingly considered to be part of the legislative process. You've referred previously to Mayor and to Conor Talk's consensus washing, but these people now occupy that position, which is called stakeholder. This is stakeholder policies. So when governments want to consult with the people, they either do the wonderful thing of the Citizens' Assembly, and there's an interesting one, Gary, talking about things getting it wrong. Considering the Citizens' Assembly is this wonderfully representative bunch of people telling us what the people believe in their hearts, they got this one rather wrong. But the other thing is the stakeholders are asked, because it's a proxy, instead of asking people that might actually tell you something different, we can go to the stakeholders. So the National Women's Council will be a stakeholder. Pavy Point on certain issues might be a stakeholder. Whatever it is, IBEC, they're stakeholders. And you can go to it's a proxy for actual consultation. But you've covered your arse. They've done their consultation. They've got their say, and they've contributed to the legislation, and the caravan moves on.
No, in many ways they actually perform functions similar to consultancy firms in businesses. Sometimes consultancy firms are brought in explicitly for their expertise on particular areas. Other times they're brought in because there's a decision you want to make and you want some sort of outside imprint on it that you can go, oh, well, this was what McKenzie recommended.
Yeah.
Rather than, this is absolutely what I want to do, but I'll get the blame if it goes wrong.
So you were saying before that we don't know why people voted, right? Because we don't have decent exit polling that can tell us why people voted. Now, that is true, but I think there is something we can say, particularly when you look at the 27 split. We can say that whatever happened, the government failed to convince the people that there was a need for this referendum, and that there was a need to change the constitution. That they failed to convince people. And there may be a variety of underlying individual reasons, but their campaign failed. And that seems like, statements are bleeding obvious. But what I found kind of, depressing and almost a little bit scary was the commentary on certain people afterwards. I don't know, do you see one prominent academic basically saying that RTE would have to take its share of the blame?
They had Michael McDowell on.
Yeah, they had Michael McDowell on with his, what was the phrase she used?
I believe it was single transferable fear.
Yeah.
Which, to be fair, it's a good line.
It's a good line. I don't know what it means, but it's a good line.
It gets the people going. Provocative.
There are two things about that statement that struck me. First of all, there was an incredible lack of humility in recognising that the concerns that Micheál McDowell had, which in some part were reflected if they were in fact true reflection, were reflected in the concerns of the Attorney General in the leak that we got that was published by the Ditch the night before during the moratorium. So it wasn't that these concerns that Micheál McDowell had were absolutely fantastical or baseless. But she dismisses them. And the second thing, what exactly would a democracy look like if only the people that she approved of were given access to the media?
The best kind of democracy, Michael. One in which everyone agrees with you. Because they say the problem with democracy is the people. So, if you can control what the people are told, that makes democracy a lot more palatable to a certain class of person. It's very messy.
I get that, Gary, but do you not see that it seems to me anyway, a fairly radical lack of awareness of what, for a very bright person and senior academic, etc., that what you're saying is that by allowing other voices, dissenting voices on, RTE had in a sense failed. They had done bad thing. They had confused the people, Gary. They had confused them and put bad and incorrect ideas in their head. As I said, lack of humility there. No consideration of the possibility that Micheál McDowell might, to any extent, have been actually correct in his concerns. RTE had allowed these dissenting voices on, and these voices had confused the people. And basically, when you confuse them, poor lambs, this is what happens.
When you induce someone to sin, you have sinned yourself.
You're like that, don't you?
I do. It's a very good line. I like it. Going to use it more, not less. There's a certain section of, particularly the academics, who have a view of what the Irish media is, which is actually deeply insulting to the Irish media if they cared enough to note it, which is that the Irish media is basically an arm of them and exists to support certain things and, to keep the right people on and the wrong people off. And it does make me consider, and I don't want to say this in a way that makes it seem like I am taking undue credit, nor that I believe credit is something to be sought here, but it does make me wonder how much Gript influenced this referendum and the vote. Not just directly through its reporting, but if you recall, Michael, during previous referendums, we've had an issue where sometimes technical groups like doctors would make statements and they either wouldn't be covered by the media at all,
yes,
or they'd be edited, or they would be reported, but reported in the worst possible light.
Yes.
And really, you just had to take that. That was just what was happening to you, because none of the other media would give a shit about it. And that, I think, has changed slightly now, because, if, let's say, Michael McDowell wants to say something and no one else is interested in it, we would happily do a long-form video with them, and put it up and get God knows how many views. And all media organisations watch each other and have an idea of roughly what they will do, because you kind of get a sense for them. And I think Gript has changed the nature of the ecosystem. It has changed the environment in which it exists, like a stone being thrown into a river. Like a large stone. The water has to move around it. It changes the way things are. I think Gript has done that. I think we saw an amount of stuff being covered in a way that would not have been covered had we not been here by other media organisations that realised there's no point ignoring something or covering it in a certain way because they would get the message out anyway now.
Yeah, I think it's true. And I think the first point you made about the way a certain class of people regard the media and the function of the media is absolutely on the nose. They don't see it as a source of information, a sort of reportage. They think that the idea that the function of a newspaper or a news program is to tell you the facts is an incredibly naive and, in fact, regressive way of looking at it, because there are no such things ultimately as facts. Everything exists in context. We have the reader is the text. So the job is to tell the truth, not the facts. And in the same way as they regard the purpose of art, the theatre, not as something to elevate or to be beautiful, but rather to lead on to the revolution. Everything is agitprop. All journalists should be, in fact, campaigning journalists. The problem with that is that if you start to see that move, and we certainly have seen that move in Ireland, maybe in other countries you've seen it more dramatically, I don't know. But certainly you've seen that move in Ireland. And I suppose it became absolutely clear during the repeal referendum where newspapers and journalists came out straight away and said, wait, I am not attempting an unbiased position on this. I am going to be campaigning on this. The problem is if you do that and that becomes the established environment that people consume, and then somebody else comes up and starts doing something different and starts listening to different voices that are either being excluded or are being so heavily edited that it's worse than being excluded, and that enough people start to access that, then that's a problem. And then you have to modify your behaviour, or you start to take a hit. Also, I think, if I want to be maybe uncharacteristically side, I think most people who work in journalism in Ireland still want, at some level, to be journalists. And there may be, in a deep, dark corner of their hearts, an unspoken gratitude to the likes of Gript, that it's forcing the places where they work to actually allow them to be journalists.
If I were to assume what the likely reaction to Gript will be in the media over the coming weeks, gratitude is going to be fairly far down that list. Whatever about people may feel individually.
I'm talking individually, not as massive, not as an organisation. No.
I think we were most likely going to be blamed for this. If we're going to be blamed for it, we may as well take some of the credit for it.
I think there will be lists, Gary. In fact, I think there are already lists of why it failed, both from those people who are happy it failed and those people who are deeply unhappy it failed. And I think this Gript is going to appear on all of those lists. I don't know, you won't remember it, but you might have come across it in references. It became a kind of an artifact of political geeks. After one of the Conservative Party victories, I think back in the 80s, or maybe it was the 1992, I can't remember. The front page of the Sun was the Sun that won it. The Sun claimed the victory for itself. And I think that if you're going to publish that headline for this referendum and recognizing, and you're going to be nice and recognize all of the people involved, I would say it was MacDougall that won it. I think there were lots of other people involved, and there were lots of other people who made important contributions. But I think that the single most important one to me, it felt like to me anyway, was MacDougall. MacDougall was also the one that really annoyed them the most, that made them the most uncomfortable. And he really got into it. It wasn't that I thought at the beginning he would do his thing and then he would kind of disappear, but he didn't. As the longer it went, the more energized he became, and the angrier and the bitterer. It was fantastic.
I would suspect you're right on that. It's difficult, obviously, to know what the vote would have been if he was not involved, and with the immensity of the loss.
Yes.
I think what one could certainly say is that you talk to a surprising amount of people in politics who think that campaigns actually have no value, that the vote is basically over before it begins. And in certain cases that is true, but I think here you can probably see fairly starkly the difference a campaign makes, even though there's basically no official no campaign. The Yes campaign was a shambles. It was horrendous. And all it took was someone with legal expertise just going, yeah, but what's going to happen? And then suddenly it's like, oh, you can't tell people that. You cannot tell people. And actually, I think one important thing, I was saying that you can't tell how people vote, obviously, because of the lack of polling. But there's one claim that's going to be made that I think is going to be particularly egregious. And that's that people were confused about their vote. I think there's a very big difference in not knowing what the vote is about or what way you can vote, and in having looked at what you're being asked to vote on and not knowing what the actual impact of that will be. And I think a lot of people fell into that camp, where they knew what they were being asked, but they couldn't tell you what the impact would be because the government didn't know what the impact would be.
Yeah,
they couldn't tell people what it was. That, I don't think, can be blamed to people's ignorance of what they're being asked to vote for, but rather in the fact they're being asked to vote for something which the government themselves admitted would have unknown consequences. That I think is very different.
Not so much that they were confused, but that the thing itself was confused.
Yeah, there was no clarity that could be achieved. I remember I was talking to people the week before and they were saying, do you understand what's happening? I was like, yeah, I do. And they're like, what? Well, what will happen if this goes through? And they're like, oh, no one has any idea.
No.
And I'm like, but I thought you understood it. I do, yeah, but like they don't know. No one knows. This is going to become an active legal matter with potentially dozens of cases. No one can tell you how they're going to turn out, and no one can therefore tell you what the impact will be. And then we have fucking Helen McEntee coming out and saying that this won't impact on immigration because we have legislation for immigration.
Jesus. I mean,
you are the Minister for Justice, and it seems like you don't know that the Constitution is superior to legislation. That's kind of worrying. The Helen McEntee versus Michael McDowell was, shall we say, Michael, a wouldn't have been allowed in boxing. That was outside weight classes.
Also, she would have been given a standing count and then it would have been called off.
Just brutal. I did actually want to touch on Roderick O'Gorman, actually. And not just Roderick O'Gorman, but certain people. So we have, as we said, the leaked Attorney General advice. I haven't been able to confirm the authenticity of this, but it has been also reported in the Irish Times. I assume the Irish Independent has done so as well, and they would have much better contacts with ministers than we do. The fact that the government has not come out and said it's fake, I think is a very strong indication that it is actually real.
Yeah.
Roderick O'Gorman said about immigration, let's give you this line. The clear legal advice we have received is that this change is not going to change the outcome of court cases taken on immigration issues. As immigration is not a matter for the courts primarily, it's a matter for the executive. All right? Let me give you a quote from the Attorney General's advice, Michael. This is a significant amendment in that it gives a constitutional rather than merely a legislative or common law foundation for the protection of durable relationships outside marriage. Policymakers will be required to offer greater weight to the rights of the non-marital family, including in childcare, immigration and social welfare. It is likely that issues related to the application of Article 41 to non-marital families will be more heavily litigated than at present. For example, it is foreseeable that the provision will be relied upon in the context of immigration and surrogacy.
Surrogacy never came up, actually, interestingly, during the campaign.
It got mentioned, but it never actually became kind of a focus on it. Here's another. It is difficult, in the absence of clear guidance within the constitutional text or by way of legislation, it is difficult to predict with certainty how the Irish courts would interpret the concept of other durable relationships. When Gript are writing, one of the things I'm strongest on when I'm talking to staff is that you don't say that people lied. Because to say that someone lied, it's thrown around by newspapers, but it actually means that they knew the truth and made a deliberate decision to lie to you. It's not that they were mistaken.
No.
It is an absolutely different thing, a far more serious thing.
It's a conscious and deliberate choice to mislead.
Now, it is hard to look at the statements of Roderick O'Gorman versus what appears to be the actual Attorney General's advice and come to any conclusion other than that Roderick O'Gorman deliberately lied to the public. And he was not the only minister.
When I thought it was curious, shall we say it, at the very least, that into the campaign, Micheál McDowell actually used the word lie and liar. And I thought, this is a man, he is, as a politician, he's abrasive and combative, but he's not reckless. He's a very experienced lawyer. And for him to use that word, that language, that was a deliberate, conscious choice on his behalf. And I think that I don't know how massive difference it would have made to the wider public, but for nerdy people like thee and me, Gary, I think that was a real wake-up thing. Oh, he's used the L word. To use the L word is a big deal.
It was something that we debated internally in Gript, whether or not we should publish that section of it where he explicitly called them liars, because, that is potentially quite highly defamatory. And our general feeling was that based on McDowell's arguments and based on his own legal acumen, that if he was calling them liars, it was because he very clearly had an honest belief that that was the case and felt that he could back it up in a court if necessary.
Yeah.
Now, I will say this. The Attorney General does go on then to say that it's his view that it's unlikely to have particularly significant effect in the area of immigration. That's his phrasing. Any particularly significant effect in this area. But that's not all of his advice. These are people who appear to have been told that these changes will impact on immigration, that policymakers are going to have to change their view of it, that there will be more litigation, and it could be relied upon in the context of immigration and surrogacy. And that becomes, again, the clear legal advice we have received is that this change is not going to change the outcome of court cases taken on immigration issues.
Yes.
I would struggle to reconcile those two versions. And as I said, it was not just Roderick O'Gorman who said this. And if that's the case, Michael, and if ministers, multiple ministers, lied to the public about the advice they were receiving from the Attorneys General in order to convince people to put through a constitutional change, the Constitution, of course, Michael, being the document which limits what the state can do to people, to citizens. There is no more foundational text in Irish law or politics. If they were willing to lie to the public about that on a referendum that they didn't even seem to terribly care that much about, what else would they lie to you about?
Yeah. Yes. If they're going to perjure themselves for something as insignificant as this, if it was something they really cared about, what would they be willing to do? I'll tell you, I don't know if we will find out. You might be able to enlighten me further on this. You know that stuff about the advice on taxation and inheritance, and that people had asked for FOI'd for. That will come out in the coming weeks, will it?
Well, actually, it was quite interesting. I got a refusal from Roderick O'Gorman's department to give it to me because of the McKenna judgment on the day of the referendum. Now, funny thing is that the day of the referendum was not the last day they had to get back to me. So they actually answered me early just so they could turn me down because it would interfere with the referendum.
Oh, right, okay.
Now, I am going to appeal that, of course. And I don't think that their views in it will stand up. And even if they did stand up, the referendum is over. So we'll go to it and we'll go as far as we need to get access to that documentation. I suspect the Department of Finance and the Department of Justice have their own analysis of what this was going to do. And I don't think it's going to align with what people were told it was going to do. I think there are going to be concerns noted in those documents, if we ever get them, as to, shall we say, wide-ranging legal implications of it.
Yes.
Now, just on the O'Gorman thing and whether or not he did actually lie, he could take the Attorney General's view. It's unlikely that we have any particular significant effect in this area. But I don't think that translates into the clear legal advice we have received is that this is not going to change the outcome of court case. When you take it in line with the previous statement that it's going to be relied upon, there's going to be more legislation, and it's going to impact how policymakers deal with childcare, immigration and social welfare. I think there's no way we can get out without that being, at the very best, misleading. And I think it's far more likely to actually have just been a lie. That used to be a resigning matter. Actually, I don't think there was ever a point where lying to the people in order to get through a constitutional change. There's very few countries in which that would not be a resigning matter.
Lying in the Dáil used to be a thing that people used to try and avoid doing. And
leaking the budget. Do you remember when people gave a shit about that?
That used to be a crime. You could do jail if you leaked the budget. I mean,
leaking from cabinet minutes or meetings,
as opposed to live tweeting the cabinet.
Yeah, I mean that used to be a thing as well. Leaking the Attorney General's advice.
I came across a cute quote recently from a wise man. He said that a liberal is somebody who wants to make things better, and a conservative who wants to make is someone who wants to make sure things don't get worse. And anybody who doesn't have a little bit of both of them is not right in his mind.
Who are the neocons in this scenario?
Oh, well, since that was the quote, the origin of that quote was Daniel Moynihan. I suspect the neocons were out in the lobby along with the Marxists.
No, I think, what could we say? We could say a neocon is someone who wants to make it better, but is damn well sure going to make sure it gets worse first. That I think is fair to them.
Which is sometimes that's what you have to do.
Sometimes you've got to bomb someone, into democracy.
They are the living embodiment of one of my favourite cliches of politics, which is the beatings will continue until morale improves, which I love. And I think the neocon philosophy of spreading democracy is very much that, based on that principle. The beatings will continue until morale improves. Anyway, I suspect, Gary, that there's going to be more chat and chatter about this a referendum and its results and the fallout, etc., over the next week. So we'll draw a veil over it for today, and probably we'll have some more wise and wonderful things to say about it next week. Unless, of course, even more interesting things have happened before then. But until then, we should be back on Sunday. Have a great week.
All the best.